thank you all for joining us here today at Community Conversations. This is our first session of 2023. I am so excited about it, and I'm happy to share Community Conversations is almost a year old. So we have, this is our 12th lecture that we are sharing, and we have all of our lectures recorded and available on YouTube in case you have missed any of them. The topic that we're looking at this year in Community Conversation is, what does it mean to be a global citizen? What does it mean? How do we interact with each other? And we are looking at different topics over the course of the year. And this session, we're going to focus on work in the digital life. I know a topic that is quite relevant today, given many of the changes that we've experienced within society over the course of the last few years. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Here, I am very excited to present or to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Svetlana Krojtar. She is joining us from Warsaw, Poland. And before I get started with her bio, just want to give a little bit of a schedule of what today will look like. Dr. Krojtar has a presentation that she will share about the work in the digital age. If you have any questions, we're going to open it up for discussion as well towards the end. But if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat or hold off till the discussion part as well. If you have a question about something that Dr. Krojtar is talking about, please feel free to put it in the chat and I will ask her the question as she's presenting, okay? We do want to have this to be a discussion, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask Dr. Krojtar. She is a leading expert in this field. All right. All right, so let me introduce to you Dr. Krojtar, who is a specialist in labor studies, which has been her main area of professional expertise for more than 12 years. She has been mainly focused on social aspects of work and employment, digital transformations, labor markets development trends in the globalizing world, level and quality of life, human potential, and social inclusion, change in labor patterns, organizational models, business structures, and individual strategies in a rapidly digitalizing social milieu. Dr. Krojtar, thank you again for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to join this community.
Thank you. We'll just give it one moment so that we can bring up the PowerPoint, and we'll let Dr. Krojtar begin her presentation.
Okay, so can we start probably? I think that first I have to thank you all for being here, for your interest, for your trust, for your time. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's an honor to be a part of this community, as I've already told. But before I switch to the main part of my presentation and try to map the picture of the labor and employment digital shift and how the trends of in labor, work, employment are likely to look like in the future, in the near future, maybe long-term perspectives, I would like just to share with you one point. I quite much think about it. The matter is one huge frustration of studying social reality, and particularly digital shift and digital transformation, is that new challenges appear just in the process of writing articles or for example, preparing the presentations, and by the time when a piece of material is finished, submitted, or presented, we are seeing a new bunch of information, cases, they have just appeared, surprise. And once again, we are faced with this fact that social reality will always be one step in front of the reality it analyzes. It's not exactly nice, but it's the way how it works. And while we are looking for the words to describe today's processes, tomorrow comes, and here we are again late. But despite all that, we don't give up trying. And I don't want to be pathetic, but I strongly believe that it's our mission as scientists And today we also will keep doing the same, trying to map the picture of the effects of the digitalization on the world of work and employment. And first of all, I would like to attract your attention to this general context in which digitalization is being unfolded. In economic and social context. And I would like to begin with a simple statement. It's a part of just common sense that development of modern societies is determined by digitalization. For me, it means that more parts of the economy and society come to rely on digital technologies. For decades, we have lived in a network and quite interdependent world, which is getting rapidly saturated with digital systems based on automated reasoning and multiplied by the growing ability to quickly and cheaply exchange large amounts of information and data. And on this slide, I just put some of the examples which personally for me seemed the most exciting examples of technologies, digital technologies, which were the most revolutionary in terms of changing social reality, such as, for example, different types of technologies based on cognitive algorithms, such as robotics, cyber physical systems, and generally industry 4.0 based on neural network, on Internet of Things, and so on and so forth. But the key idea here that due to these technologies and through these technologies, and thanks to these technologies, we observe the disruption of the pre-digital business algorithms and models. And one more important point here is that these technologies, this new digital ecosystem leads to redefining the very architecture of social space, not only business processes or only economy. Virtual reality is likely to become a core part of human experience at the moment. We even, without noticing, bring more and more parts of our everyday practices from offline to the virtual part of the reality, thus creating these new patterns of communication, new forms of business activities, recreational, financial, religious, educational behavior patterns and styles, new types of algorithms and patterns of medical support, legal consulting, operation of courts, and so on. So technological innovation is transforming every part of our lives at the moment. Every single corner of this social reality is saturated with this. And of course, change in mindsets and perception of the world around us is also observed, such parts of this reality as human technological reality, natural reality, and the very relations between them. So in this context, being in this digitalized environment, being placed in this setting, we just begin to perceive the world around us differently, to identify us differently, and think in a different way about who we are and what we do here, what is work, what I have to do as a worker, how can I feel and should I feel as a worker. And probably the attitude toward each social shift goes through anxiety to acceptance, and digitalization is not definitely an exception from this rule, from this kind of trend, and we will go back to it a bit later while discussing the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on the world of work, which was quite unexpected, quite stressful, but at the same time was a source of new possibilities and new opportunities for institutions, organizations, and workers, and many other social and economic unities in entities, and so on. I would like to see the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. This kind of discourse, which is quite connected with digitalization, of course, has these implications in the world of work and employment. And we can mention a lot of factors here, a lot of processes as well. But I think the most important is that through penetration of digital technologies into the world of work and employment, we see changes on on all actually social levels, which I would define them, put them in three different aspects. The first is about new division of labor, which is about changing patterns, relations, and institutions. I will uncover it a bit later. This context, change in context, leads to transforming of values, norms, identities. And the next point is quite important for us, being people involved in this analysis and producing different kind of reflections of social reality, is rethinking of the work concept itself. And under the work concept, I mean a kind of umbrella concept, including, of course, not only work, employment and labor, but also a concept of workspace, working time, workflow, work relations, and even the term of profession is questioned. And I also would like, if we have enough time, to go back to it a bit later. But the main point here, before I would try to explain the points which are mentioned here on this slide with these pluses, I would like to concentrate to attract your attention to the fact, I think it's the key point here, which produces all mentioned here and not mentioned here as well, because we have much more examples of how digital transformation affects this field of employment. So my key point here is that how we build this post-industrial relationship with technology. If in the pre-industrial era and industrial era as well, men always took the lead in relations with technologies, today it's not always the case. And not the case at all. People can work not only on technologies, but also with technologies and even for them. And it means that digitalization is profoundly changing the labor landscape. And results in a bunch of processes, quite complicated, quite understudied, because it's quite new, and we need some mechanisms and concepts to reflect it in order to be able to manage it. And I will also go back to this idea a bit later. But now I would like to continue with new business models, for example, which emerge and disseminate, and which are quite flexible, mobile, and based on innovative principles of price and profit, for example, of organization, of communications and operations inside the organizations. New structural configurations of firms, which include different types of network companies, virtual corporations, virtual work team, virtual clusters, different kind of startups, and practices in which partial replacement of staff employers with external non-staff employers, people through a different kind of mechanisms like outsourcing, for example, also is being observed. And is becoming popular, especially in the context of COVID. But it's too early to talk about COVID. So I would also like to mention an increasing number and variety of employment forms and types, which digital technologies have made possible generally, such, for example, informal, not informal, a kind of alternative and non-standard work arrangements, such as remote, mobile, hybrid, online employment, teleworking, telecommuting, home office, digital nomadism, and some others. And it's also being observed. And remote workers at the moment become a relatively fast-growing share of the workforce, and it's also quite a new trend. The other day, I came across a description of remote workers and freelancers as invisible workers, and this metaphor seems very accurate to me. And indeed, we live in the era when workers and work itself seem to lose their outline. At least we don't perceive them and perceive them as we used to do before. They are becoming like a bit elusive and vague in this social space. And of course, in this context, generally non-traditional and informal employment sectors are also growing. And one more point, I think it's also important in terms of how people identify themselves and each other in this context of work and employment change. Unlike several decades ago, when a worker was rather associated with a firm, enterprise, or some kind of big economic unit, now we more and more often perceive them as a separate and independent economic unit, especially in the context of growing numbers of freelancers or growing numbers of people who involved in crowd work, in platform work, which organize so-called crowds of solo employed people who perform their work in quite geographically scattered locations. And this process is also followed by another trend. It's quite complicated. I just can't, I'm not able to build this linear logic of uncovering this, because it's rather a kind of bunch. This when every element is quite interconnected with the other, so we don't have this classical hierarchy. But even if I seem not quite logic, I would like to mention here as well this point about the reduction of role of collective agreements and trade unions, for example, in the classic sense, as far as we are perceiving a worker in other way. So if I'm not, it's not I, maybe someone else, but the number of these people is growing. I don't identify myself with an enterprise. I'm a worker, an independent, self-employed or something. So I don't need this kind of trade union or some kind of collective organization which will support my interest. Of course, I need this, but it's going to be a kind of another organizational form, a kind of community rather than something formal. So it's just to build this general like schematic picture. Of course, the reality is much more complicated. And one more trend I would like to share with you is that this allocation of work to individuals, and organizations in locations where labor and operation is cheaper, simply. And it's also about new patterns in labor divisions, in labor division, because through these mechanisms of outsourcing or offshoring, we just see how the part of workers move to another place to support the whole industry sometimes. So it's also a new process which needs to be to be analyzed from the very beginning, as far as what it wasn't analyzed by scientists, at least before, and policymakers also need a kind of advice how to regulate this in terms of taxes, in terms of migration law, and so on and so forth. One more point here also, as automation and digitalization are increasing, we probably will see a decreased need in some types of mediator professionals who used to organize relations between providers of services and their consumers, such as travel agents, insurance and tax agents, for example. As with the advance of internet, we observe decreased need in human workers in these positions as they are replaced. We also observe erosion of traditional labor standards. We can mention many aspects of this process here, but not to spend a lot of time here. I just choose one. The spread of short-term and temporary employment contracts is also quite much changing labor relations. Also, I think it will be the last here to move forward is about changing in the structure of professions. And I would like to mention several aspects here. The first is about professional market, its structure. It embraces appearing of new technology-related disciplines emerging in response to new economic trends, to digital reality development. The second, about professional activities, covers the digitalization of work environment, with most professional activities getting digitalized, so that most professionals are engaged in making some of their expertise digitalized. For example, if we just imagine a simple and average medical worker, a usual doctor, who has to become confident of digital diagnostic equipment, electronic health cards, health regulatory software, which is linked with the patient's health histories. It's an ideal situation, but it would be good to be competitive. He or she also has to be used to teleconsultations and other practices of telemedicine, be able to use aggregated data that help to analyze other patients' health and illnesses trajectories in order to take better decisions for their personal patients. So a usual doctor, finds himself or herself in this digitalized continuum of healthcare, where they have to perfectly orient to keep being afloat on this labor market. And one more aspect which reflects rising multidisciplinarity in professions. It's also understudied, but I think it's quite worth to be mentioned, because due to increased complicatedness of social and business reality, current problems which current professionals have to deal with can't be, let's say, effectively addressed through these traditional professions and skills we already have. And it motivates some specialists in the field and in the sociology of professions, for example, to claim that the most challenging at the moment in this context is that we have to question the concept of profession itself, because the boundaries of profession, taking into account this multidisciplinarity, are quite blurred. And the professional expertise is getting open through internet, through these opportunities which are delivered from the via the internet. So if we need some kind of simple professional advice, we can just address the community of people who already got this kind of advice from another specialist. So what is a profession in general? If we have this kind of information, this professional information, which used to be closed just a decade ago, for instance, is open for us now. So should we speak about a new paradigm of work, of profession, or maybe even about post-professional society? I'm not giving an answer, just a question. It's because we have to reflect about that as well. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, and what I would like to underline here, that all the processes we have already discussed and observed on this slide, and we are witnessing during the last decades, of course, they were already underway at the moment when COVID-19 outbreak happened. But the pandemic has contributed to further accelerating and deepening of the employment digital transformation, being its quite enormously powerful catalyst. And the changes that would normally take years or decades occurred in a matter of months or even weeks. I think these numbers are quite impressive. I don't want to show a lot of numbers, but all I'm talking about is based on them. I just want to concentrate our attention today on trends, not to overload. But these numbers, I think they are quite useful here, just to get the idea of this speed of this digital transformation accelerated by the pandemic. So on the left, you can see the changing number of people working from home in the countries of European Union. Before the pandemic, I think the numbers for 2019 were almost the same. I didn't manage to find them, but in July of 2020, this proportion was almost 50%, but the US data is the winner here, because the slide, this picture illustrates change in number of these people, home working people, within only 3 weeks. Between the middle of March of 2020 and early April, the number of people working from home doubled. It's enormous growth, and this scale of transformation was just, it could only remind like a global experiment in which every person, every worker, every person living on this planet had to take part, willing or no, and try to make his or her input in trying to solve this equation with many unknowns. And digitalization of work and employment was one of the important aspects here in the most the spheres which were affected the most by this. Okay, the next, please. Mhm. And as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a lot of different types of trends. I am showing only one here, but I will mention the others afterwards. COVID-19 pandemic, the situation when people's health was endangered. Of course, we needed to rethink the very idea of development through this perspective of human potential, including people's well-being in this wide sense, like health, wealth, psychological state, and so on. And so, in this context, I'm trying to switch to organizational aspects. Organizational success is becoming directly associated with human well-being and vice versa. So, from now on, I can't say that it wasn't the case before, but here it was much stronger underlined than it used to be before. And since this organization success is becoming associated with this health and broadly well-being, business leaders are beginning to plan their activities based on this new principle. And not only principle, if we have this principle, we have to skill people, we have to have to create these kind of relative structures which are responsible for this human development and people and support of people in this different context of their life, like financial, psychological, and educational, and so on. And another aspect here that those changes in and different kind of upheavals which were here during the COVID pandemic and are still here because we don't know the consequences of this global health crisis. These challenges made leaders and managers clearly aware of the fact that it's quite vital to be able to survive in the turbulence. So an organization's ability to keep operating dependent on its capacity to minimize risks and to exist in this dynamic and unpredictable environment. So it was crucial now to integrate these crisis management principles and models and strategies in the organization's work. The next slide, please. And finally, under this pressure and because of the influence of digitalization, which was already here for several decades to date, we observe reimagination of the workflow. It's also quite schematic to show you like general trends, but generally we see that this network-based models, decentralization, and functionally elastic structures proved their efficiency in this period of uncertainty and these challenges provided by the COVID-19 outbreak and these social distancing measures, and so on. And so this trend also the next this about new corporate culture. It's obvious that if we had to concentrate on people's well-being on the one side and risk management on the other side, we move our corporate culture and our corporate values in this direction. So we value people as a main resource, which has to be supported from the company's side on the one side, and on the other, this kind of readiness to turbulences, proactiveness instead of reactiveness, and so on. I also would like to give you to share several words about what's going on with that perception of work, which is also being quite much transformed. The idea here was that with the onset of the coronavirus, many specialists were first involved in remote work. So they hadn't had any similar experience before. And as a result, work, which was continuous and uninterrupted for many employed up to that point, altered its modality. From then on, employees of the same organization, structural unit, or, for example, research group, lab, and some other kind of unit, among others, were not interacting constantly and in real time, which has normally been the case when working in the office. Many had to get used and to skilled in, not only in these new communication patterns, which were already mediated by technologies, but also get used to the delayed feedback from colleagues, supervisor, partners, and so on, employees. And the loosening of this work's attachment to the office resulted in shifts in spatial temporal model of its perception. So the experience of mass remote work and employment clearly demonstrated that co-workers did not necessarily need to be placed in the same physical environment, for example, when doing a common job. Work may be accomplished in different types of distant locations, and workplace configurations may vary. So an employee can perform effectively being outside the official working hours or official working or official space of work, and optimizing the schedule in accordance with his or her some kind of personal needs or lifestyles, styles or family situation or something like that. So on the one side, we observe greater elasticity here, but on the other side, it's a kind of new drawback which appeared in response to this flexibility. The matter is that according to some recent empirical studies, working in the home office mode often results in blurred boundaries between personal and professional spheres. And it's not rare at all for it to be followed by increased fatigue, by emotional burnout, and even family work role conflicts. And the severity, of course, of these symptoms is not yet clear and probably depend on many factors, for example, on the ratio of office and working time, on the presence, accessibility of some personal working space, have independence at home at the same time when the person is working. But generally, taking into account that remote work is it looks like a long-term trend. We have to think about it and to think about what potential solutions could be here. And the last, I think, for this slide point, it's mentioned here, and I would like to uncover one about the new principles for evaluating work effectiveness. The common traditional principles of monitoring employees and evaluating work effectiveness became inappropriate in these conditions of prevailing or at least spreading of remote work practices, because in the context of traditional office, an employee personal presence in the office, at the workplace, and their visibility were often perceived as an approval of involvement, and even sometimes as was associated with effectiveness somehow. In the new work setting, when we don't have this person just in front of our eyes, we can't approach his or her desk and check what exactly she or he is doing. This kind of evaluation refocuses, and it's now redirected towards the results rather than to this visibility. So we have to think about this kind of meaningful criteria of this evaluation, taken to expecting some kind of product presentation, I don't know, any kind of result, and trying to analyze this instead of just direct controlling people sitting at the desks. And the last slide, please. This slide presents word uncertainty index. I don't want to stop here to in details show how it's counted and things like that. It's complex, but I just want to base my conclusions on this idea of the growing word uncertainty. And of course, it's quite it's quite obvious in terms of labor and employment as well. And by the way, this trend, if I'm not mistaken, here on this picture ends with 2021, and it's like went a bit down. But this picture was built before the war aggression in Ukraine, so now it's much higher, I guess. And this slide, like this index, for me, it's just a metaphor of how we have to deal with the world if it's so much uncertain. And what we have to take into account while trying to predict it, I think that we have to make stress here on the point that this digitalization generally, and health and global health crisis as well, brought both benefits and risks, of course, to the field. On the one hand, it was a source of opportunities for economic entities to achieve some synergic effects, to I mean the digitalization in general. It's an opportunity to widen the markets, to employ people from different countries, to increase this mobility, to use to buy goods at lower prices, for example. It's personal mobility for people, for workers. And this digitalized structures help in many cases to overcome structural limitations of the system. For example, by supporting people, for example, disabled, who were not able to work before, but now due to this digital technologies, they can be involved. People who have some dependents in need of constant care, like minors or elderly people at home, and many others. So on the one hand, it's a bunch of it's a great source of opportunities. On the other, it's connected with many risks and threats, of course. And I would like to tell just several words about some of them. So on the one side, we have international labor markets. So we have to build somehow the international system of this management and regulation, including not only labor law or labor regulation, but also social protection regulation, migration, tax, and some other. We need this transnational, transboundary and international coordination. The next is that this automation and digitalization and deployment of robots or some artificial intelligence systems as a response, especially to coronavirus, created the situation in which people already more vulnerable in terms of access to labor markets found themselves at higher risks because they first lost their jobs as a result of automations of automation. These jobs such like algorithmized or physical labor were just replaced by machines in several weeks. And it's a big question for policymakers at the moment, how to reintegrate these people to labor markets, how to support them in restoring their work-life trajectories. And it's a real quest because in most countries, the education concept, so we have to educate them probably, but the education conception is still mostly constructed on the idea of college for young rather than on retraining employees, adult employees. And if you try to reskill 1 billion people in the university system, you would simply break the university system itself. So it needs to be completely reconsidered, redesigned somehow, and organized and financed through some kind of sources. Also, again, about this work-life balance. So on the one hand, we have this flexibility. On the other hand, we have these questions of work-life balance. And one more case here, it's about the digital workers involved in working on platforms, for example, often face themselves in the situations when they have to work unsociable hours, for example, or unpredictable kind of working schedule involved in this in unpredictable working schedules and so on. Moreover, this rise in informal and traditional work sectors was not followed properly by this legal support of people involved in, for example, freelance. In many countries, these people are not qualified as employed people yet, and Poland is also the case here. So they face lack of health insurance, paid maternity leave, and these social problems. And for example, work-related injury provision, some kind of retirement benefits. So it's also a case, unfortunately. And I think the last point here to close with this negative list, that on the one side we have these digital sources making us more flexible. On the other, we see access to digital tools becoming a new powerful source of social inequality. So people not having this access are even more vulnerable in the labor market in terms of potential employment and earnings than they were before. So it's also the problem. I don't want to overload you anymore. Just a final conclusion that I would like just to underline that whatever we say about future of labor, this will also be only a part of the picture, because the process itself is shaped by different, often contradictory flows, forces, and trends. We have a lot of latent processes we are not able to define at the moment, even to notice. We are facing this uncertainty, which is heightened, and the complexity of the human, technological, and natural world, and the relationship between them. So we have risks here. And finally, we have limitations of our academic, of our research lenses and measurement tools. So the only long-term prediction of how the world of work is likely to look like is that it's unpredictable. The only way we can do it, we have just stop for a moment, take all the information we have from different sources, from different disciplines, and just analyze all this bunch in order to make the next step. After that, we have to repeat everything, and it works like that now, because so many factors, so many influences, and so many effects, and this looks like a deterministic house in general. So just but it doesn't mean that we don't have to keep searching, understanding, or explaining. It still makes sense, and it still makes in this context it makes double sense. So let's continue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koitar, for the insightful presentation. I think that definitely incorporated a lot of the themes that we talk about, not only in education, but throughout the world of work. We have a few minutes for a couple questions. Is that okay? Can we take some questions? And Ken has been the first question already. Ken, I'm sorry I waited this long to ask the question, but Ken already has a question right away. Has digitization and therefore increased physical distances among workers reduced or just changed the nature of harassment?
It's quite difficult to say just this. Like I can say definitely. I think we still have a lot a lot of information to get acquainted with. I can't. I have to propose another session for this question. Because I have many references, but they are just like contradictory. And it's like in the case with many processes which are still understudied. So we just have to find somehow consistency in that. And in order to achieve that, we have to do more research.
One of the things I'll share as you were presenting, Dr. Koitar, is, when you kept mentioning remote work, and I just keep looking at my physical background. Everybody, welcome to my home office. All right, we are, presenting. I'm sorry?
Are you at home?
At my home. I'm at home. I'm sharing with many of my colleagues on this call, and you and I are conversing in very different time zones. It is evening in Poland at this point, so thank you for joining us in the late evening as well. So some of what you were presenting, I was like, we're actually living it at this current moment, right? We are literally doing these things of working remotely, working, collaborating across time zones and international landscapes.
That's true. For me, the main question is always to connect these time zones and not to be late, especially if you are a speaker for this kind of meetings. And today it was one of my main, let's say, sources of anxiety.
Well, we made it on time, so thank you for joining us on time. I hope we didn't create too much anxiety. I'll add, Dr. Koch added a comment, about appreciating the comments about the invisible worker, and glad the conversation about work culture that values results instead of visibility. Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Koch. I think that was a very interesting point as well, because is our economy, is our world of work looking at necessarily results than necessarily the length of time we spend at a particular place of employment? Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
I'm reading the...
I have a thought.
Oh no.
I know, huh? It's dangerous when I have a thought.
I'm sorry, I had a strong reaction.
You know what? Ken's questions assume that there is a closer interaction between people than when you think about the remote invisible worker. Um, and Dr. Koch mentioned, that connection. My thought is, what are the losses in moving to this model, this human factor? Because, as an educator, I went from a classroom where I'm in front of students, interacting with them, in face to face, to a Zoom thing where I don't have that opportunity to, learn as much when I'm in the physical space with those students. Um, and initially you talked about adapting to new tools. Your example of healthcare and the training in new systems, that's phenomenal, because we went from surgery to robotic surgery. We went from X-rays to MRIs. I understand that we have to adapt to that. But what happens, when you move this rapid move to digitalization and automation, like 3D printers and robotics? How does that help the worker on the assembly line? To what extent have human beings become obsolete in those sectors? Ooh, I'm throwing out these questions because I mean, your mind had me spinning. Your my mind, it was spinning because of your lecture.
First of all, I just share your anxiety about this perspective of building human relations in this digital environment. And actually, one of the main questions I'm thinking about at the moment, analyzing, and even would like to answer in one of the publications, is that how this corporate reality in terms of work, how this which could be the bridge between digital and social and human in this kind of relations. So how would we build the structure of organization and the structure of communications in order to keep this human and social, and keep people being a team and a community, because it's a difficult task while being online. And I also have a different kind of research on this topic, but and they sometimes are contradictory. But my personal opinion that on the one hand, of course, we have this opportunity to be involved and to communicate, to include people living in far or quite distant geographic regions. But on the other hand, it's a question how to build a community in these cases. And I think it's a new topic for these policymakers, these people, managers, and leaders of organizations, how to build this strategies, how to unite people. And I have the same experience in the classroom. I have to admit that it works for me. It works even worse than in case with workers. Students are quite difficult to manage from the distance. I don't know, maybe we observe some differences between American and Belarusian or Polish students, but it's for me it was a challenge. I saw this 25 empty black squares and didn't know what's going on there behind the screen.
I noticed every educator in the room smiled and nodded their head when you said that part, and that similar experience of how do you engage students online? How do we effectively share knowledge? And I will end on a little bit of a funny note, and I will just say to the audience, Dr. Kanya, who asked the question, and I work very closely together, so I did find it easier to manage my relationship with Dr. Kanya through a Zoom screen and at a distance. So in some cases, it worked out well. Just kidding. Say that with all the love in my heart. But again, I realize we're at time, and I know we could keep the conversation going. So in case anybody does have to go to another meeting or anything, I want to thank you all for your participation. Thank you for joining us here today. Our next session is going to be at the end of the month on 2/22. And actually, we're going to continue the conversation looking at global health initiatives. And Dr. Mita Saxena will be sharing her knowledge on the topic. So we will keep the conversation going in a health context. I will stay back if you have any questions, to ask and to keep the conversation going. But I just wanted to be mindful in case anyone had to run. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Korytarz, for sharing your experiences, for joining us in the evening hours from Poland. Poland.
Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you.
It's really valuable for me, and hope to see you again someday.
We will. Thank you all.